This really is a critical lesson. I was speaking at a youth conference this weekend, and there were 65 teens there. And so I asked them, I said, how many of you have doubts about your Christian faith? And I said, it's okay to have doubts. Raise your hand. And about a third of them raised their hands out of that 65. I'm sure there were others who were the same way.
Is
Have
the
I not got this
microphone
turned
on?
on?
Yeah, let me turn the pack on just so I can get it for the website.
Oh, yeah, I'm so sorry. Thank you, Jim. I knew you were standing there for a reason. I just wasn't smart enough to figure it out. But isn't that sad? And then I said, now, if you have any questions or any doubts about anything, come and see me. And some of the difficulties that they came up and talked to me about, well, I guess it was just heartbreaking to hear the challenges that these young people were going through. And maybe not what I went through when I was that age, or maybe not what you went through when you were that age, because some of you are young still. And I don't think none of you are old in here. But that troubled me a little bit.
Why are you looking at me when you?
I'm just saying, because you're right there with me, brother. You're right there with me. And then we got this little message, and this guy wrote and said this: the Bible is a compendium of fireside tables and fables, recounted orally for generations by goat herders and primitive tribes from the Stone Age, until writing was invented, and then again many different sources, transliterations and versions are written down. There's no grand central universities to organize the various versions of these stories. They were for entertainment. You see what they're saying about the Bible? This is what we talked about last time. This guy wrote this to the camp where I was speaking. They got it this weekend. He said, this is the Old Testament. The New Testament is heresy. These letters, and he has, in quote, Gospels, were written by loyal, faithful camp followers, not objective historians. At that particular time, or by contemporary writers, these tales, listen, were written many years after the supposed events. Do you hear the arguments they're using against the New Testament? This is nothing more than uninformed bias. It's just uninformed. When you look at the evidence, you say, I'm sorry, you just haven't looked at the facts, my friend. And here's what the facts are. Have you considered this? And that's what we went through last time. But isn't that interesting that came the week that I was at that conference? And he said the very things that we talked about. Now, what we want to kind of remember from the New Testament is that the copies are very near to the originals. And everything is early. The originals were written early. They were written within a generation, within 50 years of the event itself. Some of it was written within just a few months of the crucifixion and the resurrection. And it's important to remember that. Also, these folks were eyewitnesses. Okay? And that's another evidence that the New Testament is accurate and these weren't made up stories. There are extra-biblical accounts, and there are a number of them. I have them back here on this sheet behind there, but we won't go into all of those. But remember, we spoke about Josephus and how he wrote. He was a historian who defected when Rome surrounded Jerusalem and they came in and destroyed it. Well, he said, I'm not going to get killed with all the Jews. And so he went over to the Romans, but he became a historian. He wrote about Jesus. Then there's expectation. Do you remember what that represented from last week? Expectation. It was the only book that has this, by the way. None of the other religious books have this. Starts with P.
Prophecy.
Prophecy. That's exactly right. Thank you, Sheldon. Prophecy. And then they included embarrassing details, which is not what you would include if you're trying to start a movement. But they included that Peter denied it 3 times. Okay? And then the disciples suffered deprivation, torture, and execution. So there was excruciating experiences for them to pronounce or proclaim that the resurrection was true. And then they were copied precisely. Remember, exact. And what illustration did I show you, or fact did I show you about how they were copied exactly? Anybody remember? Remember the Dead
Sea Scrolls.
Dead Sea Scrolls. Remember, they found a copy of Isaiah that was 1,000 years older than the current copy that they had. And when they compared them, they were 95% word for word. That's how the Masoretes, how carefully and meticulously they copied the Scripture. So we can be sure that the New Testament is accurate and it is reliable. We have the message that God gave to those men. We can be confident about that. Now we want to look today at the resurrection, because this is a critical doctrine for us, isn't it? The resurrection. So if somebody says, well, he didn't really rise again, and there's several objections to him. Where do I need to stand about? Right here?
That's good.
Okay. There are several objections against the resurrection, and we'll go over those. You will likely run into them. Okay, so here we go. Let's talk about that. What do scholars say? Now, these are not Christian scholars. All of them. Some of them are, but not all of them. Okay, so understand that this is what the historians have come together and said, we all agree on these facts. Okay, here's what they agree on. He died by Roman crucifixion. He was buried in a private tomb. The disciples were discouraged, hiding, and had lost hope. They agree on that. His tomb was found empty very soon after the crucifixion and burial. The disciples believed they saw appearances of Jesus. Now, this is what the scholars say. They don't say that they actually did. They say, well, it was obvious they definitely believed that they saw Jesus. All right? It transformed them. They turned from cowards to courageous and started preaching in the very place where a lot of them would be tortured and executed. The sermons focused on the resurrection, right there in Jerusalem, the very place where he was crucified. You go to the Acts sermon, remember Peter talking about the resurrection. And by the way, it is something that we need to keep in our messages, our gospel messages as well. That's the important thing. That's God's stamp of approval on our forgiveness, that our sins really were laid on Christ and they were paid in full. And he rose from the dead, and that showed that God accepted his payment as a substitute for you and for me. Very important to remember that. And then, of course, it took place in Jerusalem where he had been crucified. Lastly, Sunday became the time of gathering for the church. James, the brother of Jesus, didn't believe in it. He was a skeptic until he saw Jesus risen from the dead. He became a strong believer and was executed in Jerusalem some years later. And then, last of all, began good old Saul. There he is right there, on the road to Damascus, and Christ appeared to him in a light, and he became a believer. Now, the scholars agree on those things. If this is not true, if Jesus did not rise from the dead, you might as well take a nap in church. There's no use even coming, because that's why we're here. He really did rise from the dead. I had a friend when I was a pastor would come up to me. His name was Carl, and he was a big kidder. But he said to me, "Okay, Steve, I wasn't going to come to church today, but I need to sleep." Well, that's what happens. You might as well sleep through the sermon, because there's no meaning without the resurrection. It is the ball game. We win or lose the ball game based on the resurrection. And so we need to defend it. And people are, as you're going to see, are making up all kinds of things to say it really didn't happen. So we need to point that out. But Jesus predicted his resurrection. He said Basically this, he claimed to be the Son of God. I came to pay the penalty for your sins, and I'll prove it. There you go. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days, I'll raise it back up. Now, if anybody else said that and that happened, we would say, well, something supernatural is going on. Well, that's exactly what went on with Jesus, something supernatural. He said, I'm going to die. I'm going to be buried. In 3 days, I'm going to rise again. And that one event proves everything else that he said to be true. So here's some objections. And this guy right here is the one that said, well, it's a bunch of traditions from goat herders. Remember the thing I read to you? It's just legend. But we have reports of eyewitnesses that date back to within months of the crucifixion itself. I'm going to tell you about those here in just a minute. So if somebody says this was written hundreds of years, 100 years, 150 years, 200 years later, say, no, that is not the case. We have records that have been kept within months of the crucifixion itself. It's not legend. It takes 4 generations for legends to develop. And this is within a few months, and all of the writings in the New Testament were within 1 generation of the crucifixion and resurrection itself. And Paul told us, of course, that 500 people saw the Lord. Gary Habermas is a New Testament scholar and historian. He said, look, somebody says you can't prove the resurrection. He said, you don't have to prove the resurrection. He says, all you have to prove is that Jesus really died and that people really saw him alive after he died. The resurrection's a given, even though nobody was there to see it. So if he died, and if you appeared afterward, then there was a resurrection. So those are the 2 things that we have to be real familiar with and be able to prove. Okay? And by the way, I invited 100 of my students, all of my students, to come. 3 of them, now this is how interested they are in the resurrection. 3 of them said they might come. And one of them said she would come, and then she emailed me and said, well, no, something else happened. By the way, if you want to get people to come to a service, you need to invite about 8 people. And usually 1 might show up. But that's how you really need to invite them. And invite people to church. That's really a good thing to do. All right, let's take a look at the proofs of the resurrection. You're going to think I've got E on the brain. But they all start with E. And the first is execution. You're going to see a little bit later. I'm going to put these up here because I want you to remember these terms as we go on. Execution. Jesus really did die. Now, why would we need to say that? Why would we need to prove that he really did die?
Because there's some people say that he didn't really die, and so he never was resurrected.
He never died. They said he didn't die. He just kind of passed out on the cross, and they put this severely wounded man in a tomb, rolled a rock that would take 3 or 4 or 5, and sometimes some people said 20 men to put in front of the deal. And this severely wounded man in bad need of medical treatment somehow revived in that cold tomb and pushed that rock out of the way by himself. Listen, they've got to explain it some way. If they don't want Jesus to be alive from the dead, God raised, or they don't want to believe God raised him from the dead, they've got to come up with something. So he really did die. This fellow right here is Lee Strobel. I've read several of his books. One is A Case for Christ. He was a criminal journalist, a hardcore atheist. Okay, and he knows how to investigate facts to see if facts really are true or not. And he was very adamant about Christ. His wife became a Christian, and he gave her a real hard time. And so finally she got tired of it and said, look, why don't you just investigate the resurrection just like you investigate those murders and report on those? He said, well, okay, I'll do it. And you'll find out that I'm right. Well, through the whole process, he found so much overwhelming evidence. Now, this is an investigative report, okay? He knows how to look for evidence. He became a believer. And he was actually here in Murfreesboro not too long ago. And if you want to read some really, really interesting books, read A Case for Christ. It's a good one. He's got a case for the Creator, a case for Christ, a case for faith. I guess he's getting to where he has a case for everything. I don't know. But anyway, he's a good guy. And he said this: there is in no case in all recorded history of anyone ever surviving a Roman crucifixion. Because if they did survive it for some reason, guess what happened to the Roman soldier who was doing the executing? He got executed. They were pretty motivated to make sure they were dead. All right? And these guys are trained killers. They would know if somebody was dead or not. And then this Journal of American Medical Association in 1986 said clearly the weight of historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead before the wound in his side was inflicted. So he really had died. And he really had paid the debt. His blood was shed for you and for me. Another quote. This is by an atheist historian, Gerd Ludemann. Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. Now, this guy is not on our side, but he's a historian and he looked at the facts. He said, okay, he really did die. And some people are going to say, no, he didn't die. Wait a minute. The facts are not so. He's a New Testament scholar, historian, previously from Vanderbilt. Now, that was the first E, execution, which means Jesus really did die. The second E is early. Now, this is a little different from the early over here. We're talking about the copies of the Scripture. But here we're talking about the reports of the crucifixion. They came very rapidly after the crucifixion and resurrection itself. Not 150 years later. It's not a fairy tale. It's not Paul Bunyan. This really did happen. So, we have early reports shortly after the crucifixion itself. Yet many believe it's still a legend, just a myth, fairy tale. Didn't really happen. 150 years afterward, just because of wishful thinking, the goat herders had been listening to these traditions, and somebody had finally invented writing. By the way, writing was, this guy's really off his rocker. Writing was invented a long time before that, and they wrote it all down and claimed, because of wishful thinking, that he rose from the dead 100 years or 150 years afterward. Well, that's just not the case. Whoops, wrong thing here. All right? I got to learn how to work my machine. So, here's the neat thing. We have a creed. A creed is a statement of beliefs that the early church really believed were true. They kind of rallied around these facts, and they wrote this creed down shortly after the resurrection. It contains the essence of Christianity. You can find it in 1 Corinthians 15:3. Okay, the creed is there. And we can trace this creed to within 20 years of the event of the crucifixion and the resurrection. This is a church creed. So this is way, way too soon for a legend to develop, right? Okay. We can go even earlier than 20 years. This is kind of neat stuff. I like it. Not everybody likes it. I like it. Okay. Early stuff. We know 1 to 3 years after the crucifixion, Saul, there he is again, Saul, on the road to Damascus, had an encounter with the living Christ. Listen, this man wrote 1/3 of the New Testament. Do you think he really had that encounter? I mean, he absolutely transformed the world because of that vision, not a vision, because of that actual appearance of Jesus to him. I believe he actually saw Jesus himself. And he believed he did. His name was changed to Paul. And then, after that experience, he immediately went to Damascus and met some apostles. Remember, this is 1 to 3 years afterward. Now, many believe this is when he got this creed in 1 Corinthians 15. Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. He was buried and he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures. And then it lists the number of people that saw him. That's the creed. Some people believe those people who met with him right after that experience, 1 to 3 years after the crucifixion, gave him that creed. 1 Corinthians. But others say, no, it was later. Because he waited 3 years, and 3 years later, he went to Jerusalem, and there he met Peter and James. And they believe that Peter and James gave him the creed. All right? So that's kind of where the historians are thinking. Again, this is really, really early. Paul met with Peter and James for 15 days. The Greek word he uses there, it was an investigative meeting. He said, okay, I'm checking this stuff out. I'm checking your stories out. What did you know? What did you see? And others believe this was when he was given the creed. Now, it really doesn't matter whether it was at Damascus or 3 years later at Jerusalem. It really doesn't matter. Why? Well, because that means from 1 to 6 years after the crucifixion, the creed was in existence. The creed was there. Okay. Therefore, the beliefs go back earlier into that, and as historians think, virtually to the cross itself and the resurrection itself. That's neat, isn't it? You might send this to this guy. I might even do it. I just might send it to him. Now, he's not going to believe. He had no interest in asking questions. He was just trying, for some reason, to discourage people who were believers. A 150-year time gap is not what happened. This is a news flash. This creed is a news flash. This happened. And today's news is, boom, and there it is. So, folks, we have an accurate, true story of the crucifixion. It goes right back to the beginning. And notice what this scholar said. James Dunn, New Testament scholar, Jesus Remembered. This tradition, this creed, we can be entirely confident. You know, historians don't use words like that. Okay, they don't. Well, but yet there it is. We can be entirely confident it was formulated as a tradition within months of Jesus' death. How about that? So we have the accurate description of what really, really happened. It can't be a legend, folks. It can't be a legend. It takes over 100 years for a legend to develop. This was done in a few months after the crucifixion. I kind of like that. In fact, gives me some encouragement. Let's go to this next part. The tomb was found empty. Remember, these are facts that people who want to disprove the resurrection have to come up with an explanation for. They have to come up with an explanation of the empty tomb. You with me on this? All right. So the tomb was definitely found empty. The historical record tells us that he was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. All right? Matthew tells us it was sealed. Pilate sealed. It was guarded with a Roman guard. These would be trained killers. Spears, sword, shield. They knew how to kill people. And when you think about it, could a bunch of scared fishermen overcome trained killers? These were the Marines of the time. All right? If you want to say it that way. Or Navy SEALs or Army or whatever. I hope nobody's from another deal. I just need to be careful about that. But they were the killers. And yet, it was discovered empty. Empty. Now, this is important, folks, so hang on to this. Dr. William Lane Craig, The location of Jesus' burial site was well known to Jew and to Christian alike. Everybody knew where it was. Listen, it was just outside Jerusalem. Joseph of Arimathea, the Sanhedrin, he was a member of the Sanhedrin court. They would have all known where his tomb was. So everybody knew where the tomb was. So the first reason we know that the tomb was empty is called the Jerusalem factor. And I'll put that up here so we can remember. The Jerusalem factor. Okay? It was in the city. So if Jesus had died and was still in the tomb, and the disciples were out there preaching, he rose from the dead, what could have been done to disprove that?
Go open the tomb.
Go open the tomb. They could go check. Did they do it? He wasn't there. And they knew he wasn't there. That's really, really important. I like what Craig went on to say. It would have been highly difficult for a movement based on the resurrection to spring into existence in the very city where he had been executed just a few weeks before, unless the tomb was really empty. That's the only reason this movement got started, was because the tomb was empty. There was no body. I like that. Now, let's look at the second reason that we can know there was an empty tomb, and we'll call that reason embarrassment. Okay, this is all proving that the tomb was empty. Now, listen, hang on now to this. This is really interesting, and it's part of the culture of that time. They ask the question, does the statement embarrass the writer? If you're starting a movement, would you say something that would discount your movement or discredit your movement? You wouldn't do that. You wanted to start a movement. So they wouldn't say things that would really hurt their cause. So they ask, does a statement embarrass them or hurt their cause? If it hurts their cause, it's probably true. Get it? It's probably true if it hurts their cause. So, if they were going to make something up, they wouldn't make something up that would hurt the cause they were trying to promote. They would want to look good. But, who found the empty tomb?
Mary, the two ladies.
Women.
Mm-hmm.
Women found it. Okay? The women had the courage, the men were hiding. That's the deal. I mean, that's just the way it is. Women discovered the tomb. Now, here's the problem. Now, listen to this. This is why reporting or writing down that women found the empty tomb would hurt their cause, which is why it is true. It's probably true because they did that. First century testimony of women was not considered to be credible. This is the first century. Okay. Guess what? Women could not testify in court. They couldn't give facts because they didn't think they're not giving those facts right. I don't know what, that's just the mindset. So if they were making up the story, why didn't they say John found the empty tomb? If they were making up a story, they would have a disciple do it, a man, not a woman. But they told the truth just like it happened. That's why we know that embarrassing detail proves that this really did happen. If John had done it, that would have strengthened their cause. Saying women discovered it hurt their cause. That's why we know the empty tomb because of embarrassment. We know that the reports of the empty tomb is true. The last is the enemy. Enemy attestation. Attestation is just a fancy word which means to provide evidence for. So let's put the word enemy here. And so you can see that all of that relates to why the tomb was empty. Okay? What were they saying? Remember the guards fell asleep? They came up, what are we going to do? He's gone. And what was going to happen to them? Execution. Jews said, look, don't worry about it. They paid them money. Go around and tell everybody what?
Somebody stole the body.
Disciples stole the body. So they told them to do that. So they got the soldiers from being killed. This was their cover story. And we know from sources inside and outside the New Testament that the opponents of Jesus were saying the disciples stole the body. It's a cover story. What were they doing? They were conceding that it really was empty. That's what they're saying. Okay, we know it's empty. Now we got to come up with something that people will believe so they don't believe this crazy guy rose from the dead like he said he was going to do. So that's what they did. Enemy attestation. So I got students that come up to me. I don't have my homework. Why not? My dog ate my homework. Okay, I ought to start writing down all the excuses I've heard. My pet cockroach died. I don't know. All these kind of things, okay? The student says, the dog ate my homework. He's admitting he doesn't have his homework, right? The Jews were saying, hey, say the disciples just stole his body. They were admitting, there's no body. There's nobody there. Okay? The question, and this is so important, I like this, the question of history has never been, was the tomb of Jesus empty? The question of history has always been, how did it get empty? And that's what the theories of the resurrection are trying to answer, especially the ones that don't want Jesus to be part of it. The disciples hiding behind locked doors, no deal for them. The Romans wouldn't want to steal his body. Why? They wanted him dead. The Jews wouldn't want to steal his body. They wanted him dead. The disciples weren't going to steal his body and lie about it. First of all, they were hiding. They couldn't overcome Roman guards who were trained killers. And why would they want to live a life of deprivation, torture, and execution, claiming he rose from the dead? Why would people do that? Unless it really happened. And that's what happened to these guys. They suffered tremendously. The best explanation, of course, is that Jesus really did rise physically from the dead. He is not here. He is risen. That became a statement that the Christians greeted each other with in early times. And the last is proof of the resurrection is eyewitnesses. Let me see if I can do this without dropping this. Eyewitnesses. Now notice these are similar, but we're proving different things. Eyewitnesses. Okay. Did I go back some accidentally? You must have. He appeared many times after the crucifixion, about a dozen times, 515 people. Okay, 515 people can't be wrong. Right? Maybe one person can be wrong, two persons, 515? I'm not thinking so. And Paul said, look, if you don't believe this really happened, 500 people saw him, go ask them. Some of them are still alive. He's saying, you want to test me out? Hey, these guys are walking around. We'll talk to them. They saw it themselves too. Indoors, outdoors, nighttime, daytime, they touched him, talked with him, ate with him. They saw him. They saw the physical Jesus alive. And guess what? He's alive today. Mm-hmm. And he can transform your life, and he can transform my life, and the lives of those dear young people with all the problems I heard last week. He can transform their lives as well. And that's the message of hope I love with them. Most of the facts we know from ancient history, for one, most of them from one source, maybe two. We've got 9 sources that talk about people encountering the risen Christ. That's tremendous. Tremendous. The encounter with Christ transformed them. And then we know they lived lives of suffering. That some were executed, some were tortured. We know that happened to them. All they had to do is say, hey, we made it up. It didn't really happen, and they could have saved their lives, but they didn't. Listen, these men saw Jesus physically alive after he had really been dead. I think that's a good lesson for us. Of course, you know that Peter was crucified upside down. Listen to this one. I like this. Here's our atheist back again. Okay. It may well be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. Garrett Ludeman, atheist. Now he says it was a hallucination. He says it was a hallucination. Guess what? 500 people do not have the same hallucination. Ain't going to happen. Doesn't happen. You can ask the specialist. In that case, one person will have a hallucination, another person will have another one, but those two people won't have the same one. 515 people had to have the same hallucination for the hallucination theory to work, and that's what Gudeman said. Well, that's the only way I can explain it. I know they saw him, but it had to be a hallucination. Because he doesn't want a real Jesus. He's an atheist. You don't want him to be God. Doesn't believe in miracles. He's a naturalist. Okay. What's the problem? If it was a hallucination, the body would still be in the tomb. But what have we already established? The tomb was empty. The tomb was empty. Problem, right? So your explanation has to really prove everything. That one doesn't. So here's the proof. He really died. The accounts are within months of when it happened. The tomb was empty. We know because of the Jerusalem factor, because of the embarrassment. It happened, the Jerusalem factor is it was in the city where they were preaching. The women found it. The enemy said that they stole his body. So that proves the empty tomb, and eyewitnesses actually saw it happen. So all of these things, execution, early, empty, eyewitnesses, prove the resurrection. Anybody close your eyes and say those four things?
Empty eyewitnesses, early, empty,
You got empty eyewitnesses,
early.
early, and execution. He really died. Okay, there you go. Okay, you need to study a little more for this quiz, and we'll take it again. Sometime. It's clear proof he really did rise from the dead. So I'm not going to go through all of these things here on the end because I don't have time, and we got choir practice tonight. So when they're talking about things, or they're talking about a theory, they have to explain the empty tomb, they have to explain the appearances, and they have to explain why the disciples were transformed. Okay, those are the three facts that must be proven for any theory to be accepted as adequate. And there are many theories out there. Of course, the empty tomb, we've talked about the empty tomb. They're early independent sources. Mark's account was very, very simple. Very simple. No embellishment, no great, exaggerating terms. He just said, hey, he died, rose again. People saw him. A lot of people saw him later. And that was it. Well, if he was trying to make something fantastic about it, why didn't he say it a little more exaggerated than that? Well, it's because he just reported it as it was, right? That's all it was. That's all he was doing. 2,200 publications on the resurrection. Gary Habermas looked at those. 75% accept the empty tomb. So we know that's true. What about the post-mortem appearances? Okay, we know those are true. There's the deal from the different sources. Peter saw him, the 12 saw him, women saw him, disciples saw him. All of those are there. And this is in your notes, so I'm not going to take time to look at it. Paul implied that his appearances were real, and you can look in your notes and see those comments about that. Okay? These are all post-mortem appearances. The gospel accounts show the resurrection was physical, and they present the resurrection as a physical resurrection. Okay? And you can read your notes about that. I'm just going to go through this quick. That's why, and thanks to Shelby for typing these notes up for me. He's given me a wonderful idea because it's so much information. I can type it up and hand it to you. You can go back and review it later. And I appreciate it. Now I've got to type them all up because Shelby got me started. But that's okay. I don't mind doing that, really. It's just a good idea. The appearance were not visions. They would say it's a vision. Well, what about the fact that the disciples believed in the resurrection? Well, somebody said, you know what? They're resurrection pagan stories. They just copied some pagan stories. Well, no. Pagan heroes were physical people who did some really, really good things, and then they were promoted to divination. That's not what happened with Jesus at all, okay? And so it's not pagan, and I'm not going to go over that in detail. They didn't believe, they didn't copy Jewish sources because the Jews believed the only resurrection that would happen would be at the end of time. Okay? So when Lazarus died, Martha came out and said, yeah, well, he'll rise again. Well, we know he'll rise again on the last days. That's what she was thinking. That's what the Jewish thought was. Said, no, he's going to be coming around sooner than that. But Jesus said. So let's leave that out. I'm going to not go into that. You can read those things. So the disciples stole the body and lied about it. Okay? Can they explain the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances and the transformed disciples. Nah, that doesn't really do too well. They couldn't overcome the guards. The disciples, why would they do that? Claim he was dead when that was really the opposite of what would have actually happened. And it would have been impossible for them to make up that story in the very city where he was crucified. And their change in their life, the change in their life was so dramatic. It transformed them. I think I wrote that, or I'm sure Shelby copied that in there. I'm going to let you read that on your own. I'm going to go on. So I don't think the conspiracy theory works. How about the apparent death hypothesis? He just appeared to die. Well, that doesn't work. It doesn't answer these questions or deal with the empty tomb. Okay. The Gospels are authentic. We know these facts. The text is pure. We have so many original copies. They are reliable. And the apostles were neither deceivers nor were they deceived. Jesus was not completely dead is the question or the objection they bring up. He just revived in the tomb. Well, it's not going to happen for a severely wounded man. And the disciples were energized because they had seen him. If they'd seen a half-dead man in bad need of medical attention, they wouldn't have been so excited about preaching. Right? But they were excited about preaching because a dead man came back to life. Okay. So the death hypothesis. Well, here's another hypothesis. The women got lost. Okay. My wife would never get lost. All I have to do is say, all right, where do you want to go? Okay, that's 3.5 miles from this mall. Everything's with a mall. Okay. She can find anything within 10 miles of any mall anywhere. Okay. But the women got lost. And it was a mistake. They went, there was a caretaker there. Where's Jesus? He's not here. Well, where is he? Well, he's somewhere else. Okay. So they left him. They thought that he had risen from the dead. Well, why were they so unnerved that they ran away? And what about all those post-mortem, after-death appearances and all of that? And the sight was known to Jews and Christians alike. They knew exactly where Jesus was. I don't think that one works. Another one is they displaced the body. Okay? So Joseph of Arimathea put it in his tomb, and then he came back pretty quickly, took it out of the tomb, and buried him in a criminal's graveyard. But he failed to tell the disciples or anybody else. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Also, the fact that he did appear. It doesn't answer that hypothesis, does not answer that question. So that doesn't work. Hallucination, we talked about that already. I'm not going to go over that again. But groups don't have hallucinations. And you've got your notes there. We're wrapping it up here. So, there's the best hypothesis. God raised him from the dead. There it is. Supernaturally. And that explains the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, and the transformed disciples. That's the only hypothesis that does it. And when you're reasoning, you look at all the evidence and say, now, which hypothesis does the evidence most point to? And that's exactly what we have here. Those other folks just don't want to believe it. He rose from the dead. And listen to this encouraging thing. I think this is one of the best things that we can hear. He says, look, because I live, guess what? You will live. Because I'm alive, you're going to live. Isn't that great to know? I mean, this old body's going to wear out. I mean, the second law of thermodynamics is working on all of us. I know that's true because something new is hurting on me every day. Okay? So we all falling apart, right? But one day we are going to graduate. I like to say graduate. We're going to graduate from this life. We're going to be, Christians don't die. They just change locations. And we're going to change locations. We live here and now we're going to live with God. And the guarantee of that is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I think that's, don't we have the best message in the world? Don't we have that? Mm-hmm. We really, really do. We don't need to be afraid of that. And I had a student who said he was going to come and say, what are you going to talk about? I'm going to talk about the proof of the resurrection. Oh. And then he was not interested anymore. Maybe that's a sad thing. But it is true. If I ever get a chance to talk to him again, I say, well, let's look at the evidence. Let's look at the evidence. I like this. He was born in an obscure village. How many of you have seen this? Do you know this thing? I know Shelby knows it. child of a peasant. He grew up in another village where he worked in a carpenter shop until he was 30. For 3 years he was an itinerant preacher. Never wrote a book, never held an office. Never had a family or home. Didn't go to college. Didn't live in a big city. Never traveled more than 200 miles from the place where he was born. He did none of the things that usually accompany greatness. And he had no credentials but himself. He was only 33 when the tide of public opinion turned against him. His friends ran away. One of them denied him. He was turned over to his enemies and went through the mockery of the trial. 20 centuries have come and gone, and today he's the central figure of the human race. I'm well within the mark when I say that all the armies that ever marched, all the navies that ever sailed, all the parliaments that ever sat, all the kings that ever reigned, put together, have not affected the life of a man on this earth as that one solitary life. I like to ask the young people, I said, has he affected your life? Have you made him the ruler of your life? That's a question we need to ask our young people, because they have agreement, a lot of them have agreement with facts about Jesus, but they've never yielded their life, every area of their life, to Jesus. You take my eyes, you take my ears, what I listen to, you take the friends I hang with, you take what I wear, where I go, what I say, you take it all. You are God incarnate. You are the ruler of my life. I'm giving you my life. That's what it says in Romans 12, right? Present your bodies a what? Living sacrifice to God. Wonderful news. Well, call to action is simply this. 2 decisions. Make a decision to believe. The second decision I ask people to make is make a decision to be a defender. Learn a few of these facts. Most people don't know this. They don't know James. They don't know this stuff. You learn 2 or 3 facts, they'll be blown away. They really will, because they haven't proved their own arguments. They're just believing little slogans that they've read. So this is what we do. And then if I had some time, we would look at these, but I don't know that I put these on your sheet there. But these are apps that really answer a lot of questions. Cross-examine. Stand to Reason is a really good one. Stand to Reason. I would download that app on my phone, and then you can hit that, open it up. It has biblical views of abortion, same-sex marriage, Mormon, Islam. You can name all of that stuff, and you can hit it. It has a little 3 or 4 paragraph thing, just tiny little things. It's a great tool for you. And I gave that to the young people, and it's really, really good. These are the things that I train on in the future, and I really like to do a session on the gospel, because I don't think it's clearly understood. And then these are questions we try to answer, but these are the big 8 right here. These are the big 8, and I'm going back to First Baptist in Laverne and present these. But if there's a loving God, why does this pain-racked world groan under so much suffering? These are questions they're asking. If God is morally pure, how can he sanction the slaughter of innocent children in the Old Testament, Canaanites? They'll bring that up. Why are you going to kill children? I don't understand that. Why would a loving God do that? You see the questions people are asking? This is what they got in their brains. Wait a minute, I forgot that one. If the miracles of God contradict science, then how can any rational person believe that they are true? Well, the fact is that's a mistake. They don't contradict science. They don't. If God really created the universe, why does the persuasive evidence of science compel so many to conclude the unguided process of evolution accounts for life? I have a whole presentation on evolution, from the goo to you via the zoo, and that's what they believe. But that is not the case. The evolution is a theory in trouble. Scientists today are saying, hey, that just doesn't work anymore, and there's some real logical reasons why. What happens is, the professors are still teaching it, and the general population still believes it. The scientists are ahead because they have all the evidence up there, okay? Now, some of them are still going to believe it and then insist on it, but the ones that are honest, and there are some honest ones out there, say, look, this couldn't have happened by chance. Just no way. Did I read that last one? Jesus is the only way to heaven. What about the millions of people somewhere else who've never heard? If God cares about people he created, why is he sending so many to eternal torture in hell? Just because they don't believe the right things. This is what people are asking. So we need to be able to answer these. I keep getting ahead of myself. If God is the ultimate overseer of the church, why has it been so rife with apostasy and brutality throughout the ages? And the last one, and I left the kids with that, I'm still plagued with doubts. Can I still be a Christian? So that's why I told young people this weekend. I said, you can have doubts and be a Christian. Just learn to doubt your doubts. And then I said, here's my website, here's my email. Just email me and I'll answer you. I'll try the best I can to answer your question. I may not have it at the top of my head, but guess what? I've got books that have the answer in it. And I can look it up. So if I don't have it there. Does that make sense to you folks? Not too hard, just simple stuff, but it's the real facts. Okay? Shelby, why don't you close us?